Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of Decoding Yoga. I'm so excited to be here with you because these 2 months we have been decoding yoga cues, those cues that we listen very often in a class and we probably don't have any idea what are we talking about. And as you know, I love anatomy. So majority of my explanations go into the anatomical why, what, and how. Today I chose tuck your tailbone because it's quite confusing to understand. Like, what does it mean by tucking my tailbone? And first of all, because anatomically speaking, the tailbone, the last piece, the inferior part of the spine, which is your sacrum and your coccyx, even though those parts have movements, they have a space to move. The sacrum sits in between the pelvis, right? In between the bones of the pelvis, right and left. There is a space of mobility, but we cannot move those bones alone. Basically, what we need is to move the pelvis. And usually, and I'm pretty sure this is what your asana teacher means when he says tuck your tailbone, is to neutralize your pelvis. Unfortunately, and I've seen this happening over and over again with my students. And remember that my students are people who have been practicing asanas, meditation, pranayama for quite a bit because they come to be trained to become yoga teachers, whether in person going to India or online through our online academy. So you will think that they may have some better understanding or body awareness of how and especially where the movement is coming from. But surprisingly, that doesn't happen. So when we start practicing this tuck the tailbone, I see my students going overdoing this movement and really bringing the pelvis in a posterior tilt. So it's a rounding the spine, rounding the lumbar spine. So I found quite tricky to really use that cue to achieve what we want. So, long story short, in majority of the poses, we are aiming to have a neutral pelvis. And this is from the anatomical position. We want our pelvis to be as neutral as possible. And then depending on the pose, depending on the muscles that we are working with, we will either go into anterior tilt or posterior tilt. We want that part of the body to have mobility because that area, the pelvis, the hip joint, is a very tight, strong area surrounded by a lot of ligaments. So it needs mobility. But we have to remember that the spine will follow the pelvis. So if we are tucking the tailbone all the way, it will cause that the curve of the lumbar spine will come out, kind of like instead of being this lordotic curve, it will be more straight or even trying to go more into a flexion. So the spine will round. So if this is what you want, if you want to round the spine, then yes, go into that posterior tilt. But if you want to neutralize, what I have found more useful for me and for my students is either to think in your pubic bone, to bring the pubic bone a little bit closer to your navel. That is another way to see it. Or to have the spine, the front spine, the anterior spine of your pelvis facing forward if you are standing. But for me, honestly, it really helps to think in my pubic bone, which is in the front of my body, going a little upwards, more than thinking in my posterior bones going down. So that helps me not to round the spine. And again, remember that we are aiming to have a neutral pelvis when we are standing or when we are flat on the floor. If we are on the floor in Shavasana, let's think about Shavasana. It's interesting because people will think the Shavasana is an easy pose. Usually when I ask this to my students, and I always ask, think and tell me an easy pose. And they usually say, and probably if you're familiar with the poses, you are thinking about poses and you're thinking about, I don't know, child's pose or easy cross, Sukhasana, or Shavasana or Tadasana, right? These are very common poses to think they're easy. And then I said, well, it's easy for you. That's why you thought about that pose. But that doesn't mean that it's easy or accessible to everybody. So I give an example of my Shavasana. My Shavasana for me is not easy. It's not easy at all. It's very uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable pose. So there are simple poses and complex poses. That's a different story. A simple pose is when your body needs less joints and or less movements at those joints to happen in order to produce the asana. And a complex pose is when we need more joints involved and more movements of those joints involved to create the pose. For example, easy cross, Sukhasana, is simpler than lotus pose because it requires less range of motion, less involvement in different areas than it requires lotus pose. But it's not about easy or difficult, right? It's about simple and complex. So coming back to Shavasana, when I'm on the floor, because my body is already in this lordotic space, it creates, when I'm in Shavasana, it brings even more the lordotic curvature, the hyperlordosis that I have in my lumbar spine is very uncomfortable because of the shape of my pelvis. So for me to have that neutral pelvis, I do have to think about this movement of posterior tilt. But I'm not aiming to bring my spine flat on the floor. This is not where we're aiming. We're aiming to have a neutral spine without too much of lordosis, too much of going into one direction, or too much on the opposite direction that it will be towards the floor. So I think about my pubic bone coming towards my navel to neutralize the spine. And sometimes because it's easier to surrender to a prop, I place bolster underneath my knees, and that creates that tilt that we're looking for to have when we tuck the tailbone. So it may sound a little bit too technical right now, but it's when you hear that cue again, or when you are giving this cue, remember that the intention of the cue is not necessarily moving your coccyx and your sacrum in, is neutralizing the pelvis. So let's find another ways for us to achieve that, another ways to explain that, because believe it or not, some people are very concrete in their thoughts, and they want to actually, and they ask me like, how do I move my coccyx without moving the rest? I'm like, it's impossible. You cannot move your coccyx without moving other bones. And in this case, the other bones are the pelvis. So we have been, as I say, we have been decoding the most common yoga cues. I have received so many comments and questions about other cues, and I would love to keep talking about this. Next week, we will have the final episode of this topic of this series for now. Let's see if during the year we open it again, because there's so many things that we hear that we repeat without paying much attention of what actually means, or where am I supposed to feel it, or how am I supposed to do it. So next week we will come with the last episode. I have my special guest Inga, so I hope you join us on another episode next Saturday. Have a lovely rest of the week, and I will see you and hear you in this space again next week. Bye-bye. Hi, and thank you so much for watching this video. After so many years of teaching in yoga teacher training courses, I realized that a lot of people don't understand exactly what yoga is, or they have a lot of misconceptions and doubts. And that's why I created the podcast Decoding Yoga. Every week, I share a new episode with you where I talk about cues, about postures, about yoga as a lifestyle, about these myths, these doubts, these ideas that we have been repeating in yoga classes, and we don't even know what they mean. We don't understand what those cues mean, and we keep repeating them. So we have repeated so many times that we believe they're true. So I hope you can join me in the next episode. You can watch the video here, or you can look for the show in any of the audio platforms available. And if you have a question, a doubt, you have heard a myth about yoga and you want some clarification, let me know below this video and I will be happy to create a program to reply to you. Thank you.